America didn't just abandon these forts, someone abandoned us from them. You know, I've been reading American history for years, and there's this pattern that keeps coming back. Structures so big, so expensive, so overbuilt. They don't match the stories we were taught. And for me, nothing exposes this contradiction more clearly than the old American forts, stone walls that survived centuries, bastions large enough to withstand armies that never came, engineering so precise, you'd think the builders knew something we didn't. Yet many of these forts were abandoned almost as fast as they were finished. And if that doesn't bother you, it should. So let's walk through the ruins, the ones sitting quietly along our coasts, our rivers, our borders, and ask the simplest question: why did we build these if we never really used them? Fort Jefferson, 1846 to 1875, 30 years of construction. On a remote island 70 miles west of Key West, 16 million bricks, 2,000 workers, a structure so massive it became the largest brick fort in American history. But here's the glitch. No suitable freshwater source exists on the island. No solid foundation, just coral sand. Malaria outbreaks devastated the workforce, costs ballooned. And after all this effort, the fort never fired a shot in combat, not once, officially abandoned in 1874, just 5 years after completion. It's almost as if the purpose wasn't military at all, as if the form existed before the story, and the story was written later to explain the form. Fort Adams, Rhode Island, built 1824 to 1857. Engineers called it impregnable, a masterpiece of coastal defense, casemates, tiered gun emplacements, star-shaped bastions modeled after Vauban. But during those same decades, the US had no navy capable of opposing European fleets, and no foreign power even attempted an invasion. So why did we build the third largest coastal fortification in North America when we barely had an army worth defending? Even the National Park Service admits Fort Adams never saw the fire of battle. Imagine building a massive cathedral and never holding a service. Why? Who were we planning to fight? Or were we preserving something already there? New Mexico, Fort Union, 1851, located in a remote valley far from major towns, no roads, no heavy transport networks. Yet the Army built a sprawling supply depot with warehouses bigger than some modern airports. Look at the 1866 quartermaster plans. They show infrastructure far beyond what 1,000 soldiers required. Massive adobe brick structures, stone foundations, miles of wagon yards, and again, no major battles ever happened there. The fort was abandoned in 1891, buildings left to erode. Why spend decades constructing a mega structure for a threat that never existed? Unless the threat explanation was never the point. North Carolina, Fort Macon, 1826 to 1834, a perfect pentagon, precise to sub-inch measurements, built with pre-industrial tools. But the strangest detail, the stonework, highly uniform voussoirs, vaulted archways, masonry so clean it resembles European fortresses built with centuries of stonecraft tradition. Except this wasn't Europe. This was a young America with limited skilled labor. Yet Macon's geometry rivals 17th-century French designs. Did we suddenly gain hundreds of years of architectural experience between 1800 and 1830? Or did America inherit a language of stone we pretend we discovered? Fort Delaware. Construction began 1817, completed 1859, fortress on Pea Patch Island, thick stone walls, massive moat, gun galleries stacked like ribs. But Delaware wasn't a military hotspot. No invasions, no naval battles, no strategic importance, until the Civil War by coincidence. Yet the fort's scale suggests the builders expected a far larger war, or a different kind of war, than history records. After 1865, the fort's role diminished instantly. By 1892, it was obsolete. A multi-million-dollar fortress, used for almost nothing. How do you explain that in a country supposedly strapped for early infrastructure? Two forts guarding Mobile Bay. Morgan, 1818 to 1834. Gaines, 1821 to 1853. Both have massive brick casemates, ornate masonry, overbuilt seawalls, underground powder magazines, star-shaped layouts. But here's the paradox. The Gulf Coast had almost no industrial base in the early 1800s. No major foundries, no local stone quarries, limited labor. So how did two European-grade fortresses rise in Alabama, a frontier region at the time? Some scholars propose the bricks were imported from the Northeast. If true, that means hauling millions of pounds of brick by boat across thousands of miles with early 1800s transport. Does that sound reasonable? Or does it sound like the buildings were already there, and the narrative followed later? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Every one of these forts follows the same formula. Massive construction effort. Finished after decades of labor used briefly, if at all abandoned or downgraded almost immediately. It's the opposite of normal infrastructure. Roads, bridges, ports, they grow with the country. But the forts, they peak at birth, then fade. It's like they were built for a different military doctrine, a different threat environment, a different era altogether. Or they belong to a civilization that already solved the engineering while we inherited the leftovers. Let's look at numbers, because numbers don't lie. To build Fort Jefferson alone, engineers estimate that more than 16 million bricks were used to build it. To quarry, transport, shape and lay that by hand with 1850s tools would require tens of thousands of worker hours per month. Records show far fewer workers on site. Same with Fort Adams, designed to house 2,400 soldiers, when the entire US standing army in the 1820s was around 6,000. So the fort could house 40% of the US military. Why? Why build a megafort for an army that barely existed? Unless the army wasn't the original user. Try finding original blueprints for these early forts. You'll notice something weird. Many appear only in later surveys, 1870s, 1890s, 1930s, long after construction. For Fort Union, the 1866 quartermaster drawings look more like as-built measurements, not original plans. Fort Delaware's documentation is sparse until the mid-20th century. Fort Jefferson's earliest detailed drawings come from the 1890s Coast Artillery Corps, almost 50 years after construction began. It's strange, almost like the forts existed first, and the drawings came later to explain them. Where did the labor come from? Official explanations cite enslaved labor, rented craftsmen, military engineers, civilian contractors, but the numbers don't fit. Fort Jefferson, records show 1,500 laborers at peak. At that pace, construction should have taken far longer, given the volume of material. Fort Adams. The level of stonecraft demands European-trained masons. Yet immigration records show few of them in Rhode Island in the 1820s. Fort Morgan. Brick totals exceed local production capacity by a factor of 3. So who built these? And why is the workforce a blank page in the historical record? Look at the timeline. Fort Adams obsolete by 1875. Fort Union closed 1891. Fort Jefferson abandoned 1874. Fort Delaware downgraded 1892. Fort Gaines and Morgan obsolete after 1900. A wave of abandonment sweeping across the country right as America industrialized. You'd think industrialization would make these forts even more valuable. But instead, they died off. It's almost like they didn't belong to the industrial era at all. Something before us needed them. We didn't. I'm not saying the forts are ancient. I'm not saying the history is wrong. I'm saying the scale, the skill, the speed, the silence do not add up. America's early architecture looks less like a young nation learning and more like a country waking up inside someone else's blueprint. And when you walk through these ruins, you feel it. The weight, the precision, the purpose. Like ghosts of a story we were never meant to read. So maybe the real question isn't, why were these forts abandoned? Maybe the real question is, why did we ever believe we were the first ones here?